Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you all and welcome you to our session on ESG. I think we're going to get back to it for the 2:30 session. We're right on time. This session has a really long title: New ESG Disclosure Rules and What Has Changed for Public and Private Companies. But this could be a really long and boring session where I talk about the SEC rules, but I think we're going to avoid that because I have this wonderful, esteemed panel with me to really talk about some of the practical implications of what the SEC rules are bringing, but not only that, what other stakeholders within their organizations are asking for, and kind of what they're seeing on a day-to-day basis. So we will not really touch the SEC rules in detail today or at all, but you can feel free to follow up with me if you would like a primer on all of that. So wanted to start out with a few introductions so that you know who is on the stage today, and then we'll jump right in. So my name's Mara Hodge. As Jack had mentioned, I'm an audit partner at KPMG here in Boston, and I lead our ESG audit practice, and am really working to build out our services around reporting, data, and assurance on ESG. I've been doing ESG work since 2010, as well as financial statement audits my entire career with the firm, which has been about 17 years. So happy to be here with you today, and I'll pass it over to Rick for him to introduce himself, his company, and why he's here on the panel.
Thank you, Maura. I'm here on the panel to represent those of you who have neither experience nor resources in beginning your ESG journey. I'm the CFO of a company called Definitive Healthcare. We went public in September of 2021, and we're shocked when we received our first ESG rating from ISS as part of their proxy review. We got slammed. We were the lowest possible on governance and environmental, and we were 2 from the bottom on social. And this is a company that we're incredibly socially focused, but what we realized was that was all inward facing. We had not surfaced that. And so we started about 6 months ago our journey, and we've evolved a very practical and tactical way to do it because I call it my 5% job. No resources, 5% of my time.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Christina Bertelli. I'm the CFO of Draper. It's a $700 million private nonprofit headquartered in Cambridge. So like my colleague here, I would say I'm either further behind. My purpose is probably just to say, just get started. It's coming for all of us, so we have some time, and don't let it be too daunting. At Draper, we care about ESG as 1,900 humans, members of our community, and in support of democracy, which is what our mission is. And I brought it to the attention of our CEO and board, knowing, just seeing all the emerging literature and knowing there was something out there looming. And it was one of those things when you're like, well, somebody should look into this. And then I always train myself to ask the question, well, should that somebody be you? And determined that, yeah, it probably was a finance organization that should take up the mantle to take it somewhere, learn about it, and develop some action plans. Because the finance org is uniquely qualified to interpret regulatory guidance and provide consistent, repeatable data with the right internal controls around it. And so we have nothing publicly disclosed yet. We're part of our journey, and we'll talk a little bit more sort of in the Q&A of where we focused our efforts.
Great. Good afternoon. I'm Derek D'Antilio. I'm the Chief Financial Officer of Allegro Microsystems. We're like a very small Intel. We develop semiconductor chips, but largely for electric vehicles and clean tech. So our products are focused on, and our mission is enabling a more sustainable and safer environment and safer world. So it's core to our products and technology. We're a public company, about 4,000 employees, global company. And so ESG is core to our products and core to our mission. But what we found, just like these folks here, is we're in the early innings of really having a focused ESG program. And I would say taking credit for what we actually do.
Thank you. I'm John Harris. I'm the Chief Compliance Officer for Clean Harbors. It's about $5 billion public New York Stock Exchange listed company, 20,000 employees, primarily North America, US, Canada. And we started ESG really 20 years ago. We shouldn't tell anybody. We waited until about 3 years ago to start talking about it. And it's really an interesting dynamic as some of the panelists have already mentioned, when you don't put stuff out in the public domain, you get no credit. So.
Great. Thank you all for being here today. As we were preparing for the panel, I was asked actually to maybe do a little bit of level setting before we really dove in. And so I have a few slides for us. The first is really just defining what is ESG. I hope by now we all know that the E stands for environment, S is social, and G is governance. But beyond that, I think that there's maybe a lot of confusion, or at a minimum, just difference in the way that we define it. And so the way that I look at it and the way that we're going to talk about it today is really just a framework that encompasses all of these topics and probably more. They're the ways that the environment and social issues are impacting your company, as well as potentially how your company is impacting those issues. And there are things that investors and your other stakeholders are looking at and really holding you up and thinking about whether or not you're a good company, one that you want to work for, one that you want to invest in, or one that you want to do business with. So a couple of slide numbers, and sorry, this didn't quite turn out quite right. We've conducted a number of surveys over the past year around ESG, and just wanted to highlight a few of those numbers, given we're all finance folks. 100% of the Fortune 100 report on sustainability or ESG, and 41% of those companies obtain some sort of external assurance on that information. To the left from our CEO Outlook, which you can find out on the table outside, we found two really interesting points. One is that 70% of CEOs said that ESG helps improve financial performance, but 59% have come back and said they plan to pause or reconsider their ESG efforts in the next 6 months. And so we can see that as an opportunity to really be able to prioritize and think hard about how we're thinking about ESG in the organization and what that means and where money is going to go. And we've also found that 80% of companies who've embedded ESG into their business strategy consider their programs successful. So I think hopefully this will come out a little bit in thinking about these are things that you already do as an organization and maybe should continue to enhance to both improve your performance as well as to be able to meet the disclosure requirements that are coming. And lastly, 78% of companies surveyed believe that the SEC climate reporting will require a lot of effort, more than what is happening today. And many of you may not be doing anything. There are a lot of companies out there that are already doing a lot, and there's still an incremental effort. We have looked at a number of climate comment letters that the SEC has sent out recently on climate risk and how companies are dealing with climate risk in the financial statements. 100% of companies that have received these comments are getting asked about physical risks, so how severe weather events, which are acute or chronic weather events like sea level rise, are impacting the company. And we've seen multiple follow-ups in this comment letter process. So for public companies, it's been really important to make sure that you are being consistent in what you are saying externally, as well as in your 10K around climate-related issues. Just so you know, in addition to the SEC, there are 2 other major standards out there that are being adopted by jurisdictions around the world. The ISSB, which is the International Sustainability Standards Board, and it is coming out of the IASB, so the FASB's kind of comparator. And they've set 2 standards so far, and these will be out, they're in proposal still, we're waiting for the finals to come. But individual jurisdictions will adopt this standard. And so the UK has already committed to it. We anticipate a lot of other countries that require IFRS reporting will adopt the ISSB. The EFRAG is the European Union standard setting body. They've already proposed 13 standards on ESG information, and we anticipate those to be adopted in June of next year. And so what this graphic is really showing is that we may be thinking about the SEC here in the US, but the scope and the scale of the disclosures internationally are substantially larger. And so as we understand how to tackle what we need to do as US companies. If you have subsidiaries or reporting requirements in any other country, whether for statutory purposes or, there are a lot of new requirements that are bringing many, many more companies into scope here, even if you're not publicly listed in the EU or around the world. And so there are things that should be on your radar and you should be watching for. Lastly, I just want to give you a little bit of hope. I know that you're all probably at different parts of your journey. And some of the no regrets moves that we are sharing with our clients with respect to ESG reporting is, first of all, just understand what your company is doing and start to talk to people, understand if there's reporting out there already. Because if there is, it's likely going to move into your domain as the SEC requirements come into play. And if there is no reporting already, we need to start planning for it. Get yourself educated on these requirements. Start to think about how some of this information could maybe go through your financial statement disclosure committee that already exists, because it will be moving into the 10K under the SEC requirements. It's a good practice to get into now, and you can start to ask some of the questions that are necessary. Tackling this is going to absolutely be cross-functional. It's going to take people all across your organization. So think about who should be on that task force. And then data is key in all of this, and greenhouse gas emissions are number one on the SEC's list. And so starting to think about how do you pull that inventory together, thinking, is it ready for assurance, and then taking that step on assurance. So for more information on some of the details on the SEC, on the EU requirements, and a variety of other publications that we've put out, following our financial reporting view is a great way to kind of keep up to date on some of those more educational topics. So that's all I have for slides, and I really want to jump into some of the discussion, but hopefully that was helpful from a level setting perspective, just so that we're all on the same page. So Rick, you had said you have a smaller company perspective on ESG. You're doing this as a 5% job, so tell us a little bit more about it.
Yeah, so we're a little over 200 million in revenue, just under 1,000 employees. And so what I did in order to get started was I wanted to understand our ISS rating, because that's the only agency that's presently rating us. I checked MSCI and Sustainalytics because we're a SaaS company. Those are the other leading raters, but it's just ISS. I was able to download their detailed questions and then sort through them and put them into 3 simple categories. Stuff that we're already doing today, but we never told anyone. Stuff that we are willing to do quickly, that we could adopt. And then stuff that's someday maybe. Picking up on one of the points that one of the other panelists made, I start by just defining and doing what we're already doing. That gave us the focused understanding, so that instead of sharing with the rest of the executive team 370 questions, I was able to boil it down to say, look, there's a few simple, no regret things. I wish I had read your slide, because, as I looked at peer companies, pretty much everyone signs up to the UN standards, the OECD standards, et cetera, unless you're a big fan of human slavery or your company makes political contributions. The 80-20 rule applies here. You can do a lot with that. And then you start digging in. Cybersecurity is really important if you're in the technology industry. Luckily, we had a strong base. Again, it was stuff that existed. I had to find it and then figure out how to take the level up to a point where we were comfortable disclosing it externally. As part of this little journey, I tried talking to consultants and I tried reading books. I didn't get to the right consultants because the folks that I was talking to were primarily used to Fortune 100, Fortune 500 companies that had dedicated staff. So a lot of their insights, although valuable to their client base, didn't really scale for us. what worked as a quick and dirty way was for me to pick a couple of industry peers that are already public to take a look at what they're doing. That was what led me to the UN Global Compact, et cetera, et cetera. That gave me a running start. And so that's the approach that we've taken. We started about 6 months ago. We now have those disclosures live on our website in terms of the policies. We're going to be putting the greenhouse gas emissions up later this week. We need to get this done prior to Thanksgiving because we're in a feedback period with the rating agencies. So if you need to, you can make this practical and tactical and hopefully go from 0 to 50 or 60%. That's my perspective.
Okay. Thanks, Rick. And Derek, I know that you guys are a little bit farther along. You're still a smaller company, but you do have a dedicated resource. And so how are you tackling this?
We do. We're probably in that mid-cap space right now. We're about $1 billion in revenue, publicly traded for the past 2 years. And what we found is our products are really core to our customers' sustainability efforts. So electrification of vehicles, clean tech, areas in the data center. So they're really core to our customers achieving their sustainability standards. So we started getting requests from our customers for what are we doing internally. And we've recently hired a dedicated resource in the last 3 months, one individual working between the legal group and the finance organization to help us really formalize our ESG procedures internally. And as John mentioned, we found ourselves we'd done a lot of these things over the last 15 to 20 years. We're manufacturing in various parts of the world in a highly regulated industry in fabs where electricity is big, water is big. So we've done a lot of things that make economic sense over the last several years. Now it's a question of how do we kind of account for all of those things, put them all in one place, and really focus that on ESG. So we've hired a person, we've formed an ESG steering committee, which I'm on. There are people from manufacturing on that committee, supply chain, which is core to us, on that committee, folks from legal on that committee. It's also been elevated to our NGC committee of the board of directors. And I'm finding that now we're starting to get many questions from our investors as well. So we're probably in the early innings, but we've at least formalized that. And then within our HR team, they've formalized things that fall into the social group, for example, DEI councils and things like that.
Great, yeah, and you said your customers and your vendors are thinking a lot about ESG, and I joke a little bit because one of the next things that I think is coming is trying to understand a carbon footprint or the greenhouse gas emissions at the product level. There's a standard that's being worked on for that, and I sort of joke because I feel like we're doing cost accounting or developing cost accounting, implementing SOX, and writing GAP in 3 years right now. So that's kind of where we are around ESG. Great. So Christine, I'm going to move to you next. And I know that you've emphasized wanting to ensure that your reporting aligns with your organization's missions and goals. And so, how are you addressing and structuring your ESG reporting? How are you tackling that?
Yeah, that's a question I asked myself when I embarked on this. As you could see, the slide that Mara showed, the umbrella of ESG is so broad, and it can be daunting where to start. So, core to sort of everything that we do, we start with, where's our mission? And specifically with this, where are our key stakeholders, which we think of as employees, our customers, and our community? Where are they going to expect us to have a position on these items? Which ones are going to be important to them? And so we, really want to, again, not make it so daunting, focus on a few highly relevant goals that we can control consistently and consistently report on. So we think of ourselves obviously as an R&D company where we had focused on advanced engineering solutions, and that's done by people. It's very much a labor-driven business, and so that overlap the focus on our people to meet our commitments for national security. We must be a welcoming place to talent in any of its forms. And so that ties with a lot of initiatives, again, that we're already doing. So look at things you are doing. And we're, as an engineering company, very data-driven. So we have a lot of data about, our existing staff and who we're hiring and who we're promoting and who we're retaining and who's exiting. So that's one area that we've started to put some frameworks around, and probably the area we'll start to publish externally first. A second is sustainability. What are we using and emitting, especially with wastewater, energy. We do use hazardous chemicals, and that resonates with our finance team for cost savings. And we're going to focus on those areas that don't touch our ability to execute on our mission, But there's a lot of places that don't, and we can save money, we can be better for the environment, and it's also going to resonate in our community, which is Cambridge, which is very forward-leaning in matters related to sustainability. And our sort of earlier career employee base who really cares about this. And for some of us who are older and go home and face our kids and they say, well, what are you doing? And this is a way for us to speak to them as well. So DE&I and sustainability may be low-hanging fruit, but I love that term. They're no regrets moves, and it's something that we can actually get that percentage from 0 to pretty high, and it's areas that we're actively doing, and just putting a framework around it to be able to define it and to report on it. And so picking a third area is a little bit more unique to us, and we're going to focus on data security. Which is obviously important to our employees and our customers, since we deal with classified information at the highest level. So as a private company, we have a little bit of time, but we know through either debt rating agencies, insurance companies, and we're going to be sitting in somebody's supplier chain where we're going to have to report to this. We have to report some of it to Cambridge, as cataloging everything that we do in these 3 areas, and then trying to develop the metrics through using a cross-functional team to do that.
Yeah, I mean, Cambridge has their net zero plan for 2030. The US government is requiring all of their departments to report on their greenhouse gas emissions, which then ultimately trickles down. So nobody is immune. So John, Clean Harbors has a clear connection to sustainability, just in the name, right? And the environment. But how do you use that to your advantage, and what kind of pressures does that actually create on your reporting?
That's a great question. So when you think about Clean Harbors, we started in the 80s, right around the same time the EPA did. No coincidence there in managing regulated waste and doing cleanups and things like that. And what we saw, and one of those pressures was, as part of a large supply chain for larger companies, they were looking to us for certain data and certain elements. And then even further than that, they were looking at scores we had, EcoVadis and others, and it was beginning to inhibit our ability to either bid on or perform certain procedures because we didn't have a score that was above a threshold. And so about 3 years ago, that pressure got to the point that we had to move away from what I'll commonly call the rainbow and ponies brochure on sustainability to something that had more data. And if you take nothing else away from the session today, that data really does matter. And the ability to gather it and understand what the drivers are for it and how to best use that to tell your story. And that's really where the advantage for us has come in. We've got quite a range of businesses. We collect used motor oil, we refine that into a base oil that's 100% from used old motor oil. Great green story to be able to tell. At the same time, we run incinerators in several places in the country to handle hazardous waste. And surprisingly, when you say, hey, we take waste and incinerate it, most people don't think about that being a green activity. But it really is kind of the last line of defense for environmental contamination. So whether that's what's commonly called ozone depleting substances or other highly dangerous materials, that's the right way to deal with it, both from the EPA standard and from what you see in terms of environmental testing and things like that. And being able to take the data, greenhouse gas emissions and other aspects, and communicate that around the story really does give us an advantage both with our customers and with investors. So,
I think I like that you raised that point, because there is a lot of tension often in many of these issues. We work with a number of power and utility companies and oil and gas companies, and the pressure to shift away from oil and gas. But the answer is not today to just not drill for oil anymore, right? And so how do you balance that? How do you sort of tell that story to your customers, to your key stakeholders, but still be able to uphold the responsibilities that you have to society at large? And it's a really tricky line to walk. So I think being able to tell your story in a way and focusing on that is critical. But to your point, the data is also really important. And so one of the things we're seeing as an area of focus is just starting to move around putting the rigor over this data that we're seeing over financial information. So making sure that there are process and controls in place and documentation around the information that's being collected and reported on. And actually, most importantly, we were kind of talking about this downstairs, while we have standards that are coming, none of them are final yet. And one of the biggest challenges is that there are a lot of numbers on a page. I mean, I showed a lot of numbers on the page before. And it's a question of what do they mean? Are there definitions behind them? And so understanding what those definitions are is key. So Derek, maybe to go back to you, one of the things that we talk about from a purely kind of right way to do ESG is to start out with a materiality assessment. And I know for the CFOs in the room, materiality certainly has one kind of meaning when we're talking about financial information, but how did you go about that materiality assessment? What have you learned, and how do you see that differ from how you think about financial materiality?
Sure, it's a great question, because it's significantly different than the way I've thought about materiality for the last 25 years, and I started my career as an auditor, so I understand that concept of materiality. Here they're talking about materiality in terms of what impact does it have on environmental, social, and governance. And then the SEC is going a step further and asking, for reporting around certain percentages around line items in your P&L and those sort of things, which those rules are still in the comment letter period and may or may not change over the next couple of months. So what we did was we started gathering the information that we have. We looked at the ratings we're getting today from the various constituents. We have ratings from our investors, from sustainability funds, from the large institutions, the two credit rating agencies, Moody's and S&P, and then of course ISS that rates companies on their proxy disclosures. And we brought on a full-time resource. We also brought on just recently, a Big Four firm to help us with exactly that, a materiality assessment here. And that started with surveys of our customers, surveys of certain of our big suppliers, and surveys of our 20 employees across various aspects of the company. And that work is being done right now to understand where we should really be focusing our ESG efforts. Part of that materiality assessment is really looking at how do we want to be viewed, and there's multiple different, I'm learning as we go along here in ESG, there's multiple different sort of ESG personas. You can be viewed as an employee of choice for certain reasons, as a social good company, a product-focused company that has environmental products, and a manufacturing company that with a focus on environmental. So we're trying to figure out now which of those personas do we really want to portray to our new employees, to our customers, to our vendors, and the regulators, and the surveys are factoring into that materiality assessment.
Great. Were there any interesting trends or findings that have come out of it so far?
Yeah, I think we've found that as John mentioned, we've found that we've been doing a lot of these things, I think inherently for the last probably 15 or 20 years, and I joined the company a year ago, but been in this industry quite some time, and companies in this industry have been doing a lot of what I'll call the right things, and they've really been economically focused things, trying to enhance your water usage, become much more carbon neutral, putting solar panels in our factory in the Philippines. Those things all made economic sense, but they also made social sense and environmental sense. Now it's a matter of putting those together and saying, how are we doing these things? How do we publish a report that conveys what we're doing right here? And then how do we go ahead and sharpen that as well?
Great. And I will warn you all that the definition of materiality continues to evolve. And so what Derek's just described is kind of typically what is happening today. The European Union has said that they will look at double materiality in their reporting requirements. And so it's a concept of understanding not only what impact the environment and society is having on the company. So, what is the cost of a hurricane on your company, and does that result in a material impact, a financial material impact? But also, what is the company's impact on the environment and society? So how do your operations, impact a particular community or impact the biodiversity of where you're operating? And by going through an analysis of both of those things, identifying those topics that could be material. Nobody really understands how to do this yet, to be completely honest, and so we'll see how it'll evolve. But it's something that we need to keep an eye on as those standards become finalized. So Rick, when we were talking, you mentioned that your employees care a lot about the S, which probably is not surprising. So what does that mean to you? How are you dealing with it? How are you addressing it?
I mean, for us, we won't be subject to these standards until under the current proposal 2024. But what we're finding is to be an employer of choice, especially in this area, you really need to have an informed perspective on these issues. Employees are passionate about it. We've organized a number of affinity groups just because it's the right thing to do. I think each of us has a lot of initiatives underway at some level to deal with this, but we're finding as we formalize it and as we externalize it, that helps make us more attractive as an employer of choice. So I took notes actually on the employer of choice persona that you mentioned. That's something that we've always organized ourselves around, and I hadn't realized that it could be potentially an ESG persona. But for us, that was probably the first thing that we focused on, and then the other is on the greenhouse gas, just because the current proposal has backwards-looking disclosures, and because we're fast growing and acquisitive, we sometimes shut down offices, and it's easier. It's a bit of a challenge to pry this information out of landlords anyway. We figured we might as well get it as quickly as we could.
Great. The one thing that I would mention is, we're talking a lot about the SEC climate proposal and rule. There is also expected any day now a human capital rule, or at least an update from the rule that was issued a couple of years ago. So when it came out previously, it was very principles-based. It required the number of employees, an explanation of your human capital, and how you manage it. We are anticipating more metrics in that area, so information about pay gap and information about training and employee benefits and things like that. So we aren't quite sure where that's going to land. We had anticipated seeing it in October. So we'll see when the SEC decides to drop that one as well. So I feel like most people like to learn from others' mistakes. So we're going to move into a section where we talk about some challenges that you all are facing. I do want to let you know that we've saved about 10 minutes at the end for questions from the audience. So please be thinking through them and be ready to ask them when we get there. So, John, given that you are coming to ESG with a compliance mindset, what are some of the challenges that you're facing and mistakes that you hope others can avoid?
So, to be clear, the timing was ideal. I was running internal audit at the time. COVID happened, we traveled a little bit less, and they said, hey, go figure out this ESG reporting. And that was great. But as you start down this path, you kind of want to do everything at once. And we were a ways into trying to gather data had we stepped back and kind of said up front what really matters, we would have saved ourselves some headaches. So we didn't do a lot of water reporting in the end. We thought about it up front and realized about halfway through it really didn't matter for the company and for our customers. So we're primarily business to business focused. We take primarily companies waste, and handle it. That was one area, I think, from being very intentional about what your focus area is, and it's okay to start small. We're coming out with our second full report later this year, and it's going to build on the first report because there were things that we would have liked to talk about in the first report, but we either didn't have the data, didn't have the time, or didn't have a good way to phrase it in the reporting structure. So the other thing, from a lessons learned is, it's okay to start with something, just start, right? And then the last thing I would say from things we learned is there were different stakeholders in the company, some kind of mid-level sales kind of folks, and then all the way up to the board level that I think would have appreciated more involvement early on in the process. They're happy where we landed, but it was a bit of hey, here's the report, and it's going out the door next week. And so getting folks, in particular, people that have a passion about this in your organizations engaged early on will help in the buy-in for particularly when you start setting goals and things like that down the road.
And if you don't mind me just asking, how is that board engagement? What is that experience like?
So in our case, it's very interesting. We have for the report itself, the full board reviews that report before it goes out. We work closely with two different committees, the audit committee, because it's kind of public facing, not financial reporting, but similar to that, and we expect it's going to go that way. So we've engaged with the audit committee for a lot of the detail. And then we have a environmental and health and safety committee that also has some input into the process, because we talk in the social section a lot about employee safety, and in the environmental section about compliance with laws and regulations, things that are in the charter for that environmental health and safety committee. And they did have, under the old corporate social responsibility, that was in their committee. So we've got kind of it bifurcated between those two right now for the working sessions.
Great, thanks. Christine, what are some of the biggest challenges you're thinking about?
Sure, yeah. I mean, when I first spoke, I said, go after the low-hanging fruit and don't feel bad about that. But you also have to look at ways in areas that you might have some challenges with ESG. And we heard a couple of those today. John talked about his, entanglements with hazardous chemicals, and Mara referenced, industries that are heavily fossil fuel users. And I could have taken the boring safe route and saying, some of our challenges relate to data consistency or lack of guidelines, because everyone faces those. But the thing that's interesting for Draper is that as a military contractor who makes guidance systems for weapons, among other things, that poses interesting challenges for us about articulating our ESG, environmental, social, and governance initiatives. And when it is tricky, people will notice that. And if there's a communication vacuum, they'll run in to fill it. So it really highlights the importance of looking where you might have challenges and emphasizing that you really need to control your own narrative. And so ways in which that we've talked about that is, we see our primary role as enabling the nuclear deterrence. Deterrent is the key word, and that's exists to defend democracy, and we see it as maintaining world peace. And we've heard sort of first-person accounts of, as bad as everything is in Ukraine right now, it would be so much worse if nuclear deterrence didn't exist. And many ESG funds have found ways to invest in defense stocks. NATO countries, as Mara noted, the EU is way ahead of the US on a lot of these principles. And most notably Germany, who's probably the most forward-leaning and has some of the most stringent ESG requirements for company suppliers, transactions, has vowed to ramp up their own defense spending in response to everything they're saying. And there was one Bloomberg article that I'm going to latch onto, that without the defense of democratic systems, personal freedoms, and the rule of law, there would be no ESG. So there is a unique nuance to our own story, and with it coexisting in the nature of the work that we do. But we can and do align ESG principles strongly with our mission in a way that we can be unapologetic and certainly not hypocritical about it. So you got to go after the challenges too.
That's a great point. And I think that, for a long time, ESG or sustainability or whatever you wanted to call it, social responsibility, was about, just from an investor perspective, just staying away from the sin stocks, right? We've identified the areas that we're not going to invest in, and that's it. And it's obviously become much more complicated, and now there's a push to acknowledge not only how we can be on the forefront and make change, but just the fact that the world is changing. And there's a question of, how are you responding to that? Are you part of that, or are you not? And that's obviously going to have a huge impact on your value and your ability to sustain that value over time. And I think that's really one of the underlying concepts here. So Derek, shifting back to the SEC, even though we haven't dug into it much, I'm sure you're excited to talk about some of the things that are expected that might be really challenging for you.
Absolutely. So, the SEC has both the climate change rules, the human capital rules, and then the materiality assessment, which is under debate right now in comment letter phase. We've put together a roadmap with the Big Four accounting firm of where we plan to be in by 2024, our external reporting requirements. And we're really starting with what are those requirements in 2024 for us as we understand them today, and then working our way backwards to understand, do we have the data to be able to do that? In some cases we do, in some cases we don't. We're a global company. We have facilities all over the world on 4 continents. So, just like a lot of challenges you have with financial reporting, how do we get this data? How do we consolidate this data? How do we standardize this data? We're working through those things today to make sure that we can report in 2024. And the roadmap has us issuing kind of the phase 1 reports next year, and then meeting the SEC requirements in 2024 for us.
And what are some of the harder parts of the SEC rule that you think are going to be?
As I understand it, basing the materiality limits right now that they have for the SEC, looking at each line item on the P&L and talking about 1%, materiality, what does that mean? As Mara said, two-way, really. What does that mean for your company, and what impact does your company have on those particular line items? So when you're selling your products, trying to assess what that means to the environment and social and even the governance you have around that, and then looking at the supplier side of that, what impact it has on your financials, and then what impact, when you think about your risk statements in a public company in a Form 10K, enhancing those risk statements to really account for both qualitatively right now and quantitatively what that could mean to your company. That's going to be pretty challenging, I think, for most companies.
Yeah. So just as kind of a quick update, we had anticipated final climate rules in October. We thought that they would, be effective 1/1/23, and we would just sort of move on from there. We don't have rules now. The latest that I've been hearing is it's more likely Q1, maybe a March timeframe for final rules, which would then imply or indicate that we have a 1/1/24 effective date. And then there's also some, rolling implementation timelines depending on the size of your company. Large accelerated filers would be first in 25, on 24 data in your first 10K in 25, and then kind of moving on from there. But we'll kind of see how all that plays out. But, Rick, I know you have a little bit more time, assuming not only the pushback, from the final rule, but being not a large accelerated filer. So how are you preparing, and what are you thinking about now?
What we've started to do to prepare is focusing on the no regrets. We know greenhouse gas emission quantification is challenging. As we went through our initial quantification, we realized in a number of areas it is permissible to make detailed and reasonable assumptions using available benchmarks. So that was very helpful to us. Our primary emission sources are commuting and public cloud. We use AWS and Azure. So for commuting, we simply took the miles between the employee's office and home. Our offices are located in suburban places, so we assumed that no one took public transit. We assumed in the US, SUV or truck, just to be conservative, and we were able to calculate out from that what a reasonable estimate is of our greenhouse gas emissions. Now, I'm arm wrestling with the consultants who think it would be a great idea to send a survey to all of our employees about exactly how they commute and what model of car they drive. That didn't seem practical and tactical, so they haven't convinced me of that yet. And probably the biggest challenge has been and will be sustaining attention. It's, not, 90% of the companies in here, I'll bet, have no or very limited resources. And there's an infinite amount of work that could be done. So it's just managing scope on that and managing the board's expectations. Because you sometimes have board members from large public companies who are like, oh, you ought to be doing this, 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 this.
So how do you engage with the board on ESG? Sort of what is their input into this, and what do you report up to them?
Very transparently. So going all the way back to putting this on the agenda, I was very careful to say, okay, here's how we were rated. Here's the impact. We're not getting investor questions on it yet, but this will preclude us from going after ESG funds, et cetera, and then laid out the proposed approach before we did any work. Said, we're not going to hire incremental staff, given the economic environment. So taking them along on the journey, and then just continually and respectfully pushing back when people have helpful ideas that are not yet critical for us.
And I'll wrap up with you, John. Just any thoughts on the SEC rules and how you all are preparing?
Very similar to Derek. We're getting ready. It's coming. I think it's coming a little bit later than we first thought, but it's still coming.
Good.
So.
Well, I have one more question for all the panelists, but maybe we'll switch to questions from the audience first and hear from you. Has any of this raised any questions? Are you scared, excited, ambivalent? Sorry, and I can't actually see people
Way in the
raising
back.
hands, so I see a couple in the back there. Somebody can.
Hi, just a question. In your planning on this, have you thought or expanded your planning on how it would affect the major suppliers and how they're prepared for that, which will down to your business?
Yeah, I can start, absolutely. So, our major suppliers make up a large chunk of our materials. There's basically, as Dave Zinzer was talking about this morning, in the semiconductor industry, it's only a handful of companies that actually make silicon wafers, and most of them are in Taiwan. We do have one in the United States. So it's a very concentrated supplier base, very, very large companies. So fortunately, they're actually way further ahead than we are on the ESG journey. So we're working with our suppliers on the survey side of things because we're getting asked those questions by our customers, who are some of the major automakers who are also far further ahead than we are, the BMWs of the world, the GMs of the world, and the Fords. So it's kind of interesting. We're a small player in between very large suppliers, very large customers. So we get some good data from both of them, and now they're both asking us for our data internally.
Do you think, or have you seen, is it mostly pressure to get the data, or is it to actually change sort of behavior or product in some way?
So far, it's largely been on the data. I mean, the product is enabling our customers' sustainability, and that's really good, and that's why they're buying our product, that in addition to the efficiencies they get from it. And even from the supplier standpoint, it's not so much on how we're doing things or what we're doing, it's really on making sure that we can provide the information and the data, and we're aligned with their practices, or at least the way we're conveying what we're aligned with their practices, externally, and particularly for our customers, because they're looking at their entire supply chain. We're an integral part of that supply chain. And so for us to be able to sell to those customers, they want to be able to talk to their customers about their supply chain, which we are.
I'd like to just add on to that if I can. On the customer supply chain and the data, we're starting to see, particularly from some of our European customers that have operations here in the US and Germany very specifically, inside customer contracts, expectations under a sustainability paragraph around what data you're going to provide them, their audit rights, what form or framework you're going to follow. And so we're having to push back candidly on some of this because we're going down a single path given that we're North America focused and based, and that doesn't always align out to what you're seeing come out of Europe. So from a risk standpoint, if you've got customers, particularly European based and contract renewals, just be aware that there may be some new provisions showing up in that sustainability world.
Yeah, and those of us that are not manufacturers might think, oh, that doesn't apply as much to us. One, you can think about employee commuting as being, in effect, one of your suppliers, the supplier of the most important resource, your people. And then the other thing that I believe impacts just about all of us is embedded carbon. So it wasn't obvious to me off the top of my head that we needed to account for the embedded carbon in all the laptops and servers that we buy. Luckily, I was able to get a dump from our systems of literally down to the model numbers that we use, and our outside consultants bounce that against the database in order to facilitate those calculations. And then, of course, SaaS emissions. So we looked at our major SaaS platforms. Luckily, they're all global companies, and so we were able to gather data on those. But none of us is immune from having to look at suppliers or from having our customers look at us for their reporting.
And just to be clear, the buzzword around all of this are Scope 3 emissions. So this idea that you have to report the emissions in your supply chain. There's 15 categories of Scope 3 emissions. So we've described probably about 6 of them, but there are even more than that. So just to keep that in mind. I think there was another question back there, maybe.
Hi. My name is Amanda Allen. I'm the CFO of a prop tech company, but I'm also on the advisory board for NYU's Center for Sustainable Business, which I know you have worked with.
We have.
And the mission for that school within a school, essentially, is less about the disclosure and how to deal with that and manage that, and more about viewing ESG as embedded into your strategy and a source of enterprise value, essentially. So I'd love to hear from you. Does your organization view it that way? I understand the disclosure is probably the more immediate or urgent issue, but do you have a view of, does your organization view it that way as something that's part of your strategy and a source of enterprise value? And if so, how do you measure that and manage it?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, and it's something that is a bit of a mind shift, right? So we've done a lot of very sustainable type projects, but in fairness, we didn't do them because they were sustainable projects. We did them because they made economic sense. So, for example, we pull metals out of the backside of one of our incinerators out of the ash, and we're able to take that and recycle it. We save landfill space and all that. We did all that, and it's a great green story. We did it because it saves us money. And part of this process, I think, as you look ahead, is matching up that sustainability ESG component into some of your capital allocation decisions and project considerations. And so right now, to a large extent, sustainability is kind of driving, looking in the rearview mirror, right? So what happened last year or the last couple of years, and we're working now, and we hired somebody for sustainability specifically earlier this year, and one of his mandates in 2023 is help us look out the windshield ahead and talk about what can we do that's going to impact, from a good business decision standpoint, but it's going to impact our ability to tell our story better when we put our 2023 and 2024 reports out the door.
And just to add to that, very specifically on the enterprise value aspect of things, our company meets the screening criteria for many sustainability funds when they want to invest. And we're getting a lot of inbound calls from those sustainability funds, and then they're starting to dig a bit deeper and asking, what are we doing on the ESG front tactically? So it could enhance enterprise value just by having a larger pool of investors, and that's really where we're aimed. We're aimed at sustainability, we're aimed at providing that for our customers, but it opens up a large pool of investors, and beyond that, the large institutional investors, the Fidelities, the Wellingtons, they're all incorporating criteria there, as well as the debt rating agencies. So in theory, it should have a positive impact on enterprise value over time.
Shameless plug, we are looking to form a CFO panel, so if anybody's interested in this topic and wants to advise on NYU's board, let me know.
A question back there.
My question is taking some of what Derek just said and taking it to the next level. We talk about internal people and ESG from a compliance perspective, but my question is there any evidence that investors actually value this? Because I want to point out the PE ratios on tobacco stocks have not changed. So that's my basis for my question. Has there been any evidence to say these semiconductor companies get a better PE because of ESG, not because of how they're operated, because of how profitable they are? Is Lockheed do better than Boeing? Defense play, et cetera. So I'm just wondering if anybody up there has that with specific investors other than just the call from an inbound.
Yeah, I can start with that since you mentioned semiconductor companies. So I would say indirectly, yes. When we look at our business, what we're focused on what we call secular growth areas, right? It's a nice buzzword, but it's really sustainability, electric vehicles, and the entire semiconductor industry right now, as Dave Zinza talked about, it goes through cycles. I've been in this industry for 20 years. It goes through cycles every 3 years, an inventory correction, and the semiconductor stocks get crushed. We've gotten crushed less than others this year as companies that are like us, that are focused on industries that have, I would call it a secular tailwind, so things that are sustainability focused, electrification of vehicles, clean tech, we're focused in that area, so indirectly we're getting the benefit of that, and we've seen that in our PE.
I'd add on, for our organization, we've looked at it traditionally as being a bit of a gate to make sure we didn't put hurdles up for investment, whether that was, US-based ESG fund or others. We have seen more investment from European companies since we got ESG more of a center focus and reporting out than we've seen historically. How much of that is, company performance overall? How much of that is because we did a roadshow in Europe this year? How much of that is because, the ESG? I can't tell you those specifics, but we do see momentum in that area.
And one global bank will take 20 bips off of your lending rate if you agree to provide them with the ESG disclosures. So you can create, I mean, it's not a lot, but you can create small amounts of value that way because they're dealing with their own reporting requirements, the underwritten emissions that they need to report on. So I wouldn't, for what it's worth, I wouldn't take as my primary investor relations strategy that you're going to go after the ESG funds. That's hard to do, but if you're doing it anyway to appeal to employees to comply, then you could leverage it to create some value.
Great questions. Is there one more? Go ahead.
Yes, one more. Paul Kincaid from NetAlly. Just a somewhat related question as on the M&A side. If you're looking at buying businesses, is it a real high priority of knowing what their score is, ESG? Is it a major decision-making part? Is it a major point of the buying the business?
In our case, no. In part because we tend to assimilate whatever we buy into our structure and process and reporting and all that, so not really. Now, we do pay very close attention. We bought a large industrial business, a little over $1 billion last year. We paid really close attention to their TIR and other employee safety rates. That matters. But as far as what their ESG score is as a whole, not really.
One of the trends that I am seeing, though, is for the larger companies that have set net zero goals or other types of targets, they are starting to build that into their diligence process because they've made this commitment and they need to understand how the acquisition is going to impact their ability to achieve that commitment. So there's certainly things to take into consideration there. Well, I think we're coming close to the end, so I did just want to give the panel an opportunity to share their best piece of advice and potentially next practical steps for you all before we wrap.
Keep it simple.
If you're a private enterprise like we are, and you haven't started yet, start somewhere. It's, as Mara said, it's going to hit everybody. There's so much data out there. Even Google searches. There are a couple of standards boards. It's changing so quickly. I would, if you do Google searches, only focus on the ones in the last couple of months, because if you look at something beyond that, you're probably looking at stale data.
I'm starting kind of keeping the end in mind, starting to think about what is it the message we want to convey as a company, how do we want to be seen, and then backing up from there to what we need to do to be seen as that.
I would say a decent report or even a fair report now is a lot better than a great report in 6 months.
Great. Hopefully there was a lot for you to take away and to chew on, and maybe some practical next steps that you can take around ESG. And I want to thank all our panelists again today for joining me here, and thank you all.
Thank you.